typically folks won't do an investment unless it's a simple 3-year payback period, which to me is ridiculous. I would finance all day long at 30%. Dan, I'll go borrow. I would, mortgage my house again, basically, refinance the house if you could give me 30% rate of return. And yet you have plenty of commercial industrial facilities that turn up their nose at that kind of ROI for efficiency investments because they're so focused on selling widgets over here. And so I think one of the things companies really need to do is make sure that they've got really smart people in the energy management game because it means more than it used to in terms of the volatility and the risk and potential opportunities to manage that.
The energy landscape is shifting all around us and quickly, and every single employee in our organizations needs to know why. Companies that fail to adapt risk losing relevance and fast. Today on Renewable Rides, we're thrilled to welcome a true expert who's been shaping this transformation. Peter Kelly-Detwiler, as the author of The Energy Switch, How Companies and Customers Are Transforming the Electrical Grid and the Future of Power. Peter brings a front row perspective on the massive changes revolutionizing how we power our lives and our businesses. With decades of experience leading energy innovation at Fortune 125 companies and advising global giants like GE, Nike, and SunPower, Peter's insights are the ones you need to future-proof your organization. He's built game-changing tools like VirtuWatt, consulted with startups navigating the energy revolution, and shares his knowledge as a Forbes contributor. Get ready for an electrifying conversation about the technologies, trends, and strategies reshaping the energy grid and why embracing these changes isn't just smart, but essential. So let's go.
Peter, it is an absolute pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. And, we've met at a couple of Smart Energy Decisions events, and excited to have you share some of your research and your knowledge with our guests. As you know, we always like to start with understanding a bit more of what are you passionate about, both personally and or professionally.
Well, personally, I just got off the water. It's December 9th, and you can see I've got actually blisters on my hands. I was rowing this morning at around 7:30 in the morning. The temperatures were 31 degrees, so the ice actually was forming on the boat, and I had ice in the hull that I had to pour hot water into to melt and then flip the cockpit so I could actually get it going. But so I did that. I rode 8 miles for, an hour and a quarter, hour and a half this morning, and then got into my other passion, which is trying to figure out how do we as humanity undertake successfully, one hopes, the greatest thing we've ever tried to accomplish collectively as a species, which is decarbonize, completely shift a global energy economy, which means pulling on all kinds of technologies and levers and finance and all that stuff. And I would say that's not really a passion. It's more of an obsession. And so I start the day, usually if I'm not rowing, I have 42 newsletters that I typically scan each day with about 150 article titles because there's just so much going on that in order to stay on top of it, you just have to rip through a whole lot of information. Oh, I will make the offer if anybody wants. I have a spreadsheet with all those 42 newsletters and the URLs for the signups and so on. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn with your email, please, and ask me for the reading list, and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Love that. That's so good. Where did this passion and addiction come from, Peter? Where did you first learn that you were passionate about helping us decarbonize and actually shift how we think about energy?
It's funny when someone asked me that once, and when I was little, I remember driving into Boston, just watching all the cars and thinking, watching like the exhaust come out of all of them and think there's going to be a better way to do this. And so back then I was probably 8 or 9. I was thinking, what if we could hook them all up to like a ski lift? So there's one engine that just pulls everybody in and then they go off in their directions, from Central Depot. So I've always kind of tried to figure those things out. But then I actually ended up working in development economics. That was the career I was headed towards. I was in Somalia for 6 months and then all over Western Africa doing auditing work and so on. But and my wife and I just got married. We were living there. We had a difficult pregnancy, she more than I. But we came back to the States. It worked out great. And I was looking for a job. And she said, every time you pick up The Economist, you go straight to the environmental issues. why don't you start to focus more in those areas? And lo and behold, so I put the network out with friends saying, here's what I'm looking for. And a bunch of people that I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts said, hey, we'll keep an eye out for you. One of them found a job with a startup for me. It was a guy who was a brilliant MIT graduate focused on Hydro-Quebec. And HQ at the time was building these mega dams without the Aboriginal community's say-so in many instances. And so we were hired to make the argument that, in fact, we could export relatively expensive hydropower from Canada, or we could invest in energy efficiency and some natural gas combined cycle turbines. And together, those would be a cheaper package. So I didn't know anything about electricity, but this guy was like sitting at the right hand of God, and he didn't like to write. So I had to start to understand what he was saying and then internalize it. And then I just learned over the last, 34 years, I've learned on the job.
There's so many different areas that we will take this conversation. But before we do, over the past several years, share with our listeners kind of what's really been capturing your time. I know that sometimes you get hired by companies to go down certain research paths. You've written a very powerful and very educational book, The Energy Switch. You're working on a new one. Share with our listeners kind of what's been capturing your time and attention over the last several years, and what within that gets you most excited.
Sure. So let's start with the new book. So there I'm working on a book called, the preliminary title right now is called A Matter of Degrees. And here we'll venture into the world of carbon. Carbon capture, storage, what's going on with the technologies, direct air capture, smokestack capture, et cetera. Why are people doing it? How does that translate into voluntary markets and so on? Because if you look at big picture, the recipe for decarbonizing the global economy, carbon capture's got to be a piece of that equation because fossil fuel ain't going away anytime soon. So that's sort of the next frontier over here. And then within the grid space, as I mentioned, the data center load, which just has sort of popped out of nowhere. And then the really other interesting piece of it is there's a couple. First of all, on the bulk power side, how do we continue to decarbonize? And the challenge there is you get to like 30, 40% integration of solar and wind, and now you really start to need some storage. You start with 4 hours, but then you get to 50, 60, 70%. Now you need 12 hours, 24 hours sort of storage, because you start to have to deal with more of these shorter term energy droughts when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. And then as you decarbonize even more and more, now you're relying a lot on wind and solar. Well, what happens if you have that atmospheric river coming in off of California, let's say, and you're reducing your solar output by 2/3? Well, what do you do now? Well, certainly long-term duration, like Form Energy's iron air batteries with 100 hours of duration, that can help. But now you also have to start to really think about what's happening on the customer side of the meter. I mean, you always did, but now it becomes really critical.
Yeah, I love that, Peter. I think there's multiple sides to the equation here, isn't there? And I think there's the utility side where it's all about reliable, safe power, and it's going to be incrementally chipping away. On the business side, I loved your LinkedIn profile. I'll read it out because I think it's really important. You say every single employee in your organization needs to know how and why the electric grid is evolving rapidly to something new, cleaner, more data intensive, and increasingly decentralized. Companies that fail to adapt to this rapidly evolving landscape risk losing relevance and competitiveness. So when you fast forward this out, Peter, I think that massively resonates for me because I think businesses are on the front line of this, and they're the ones incurring escalating energy costs. They're under pressure to reduce their emissions. They're facing resilience issues. Those that don't adapt perish. So, what's the image of what business leaders should be thinking about if you fast forward out 10, 20, 30 years? What does the grid look like in your mind, and how should they be thinking about, how they move towards this?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing they need to think about is what's their sensitivity to power prices. And I'll give you a really good example of that. You remember it was 2004, 2005 when these hurricanes roared through the Gulf and they tore up a lot of the pipelines. And anything that had, say, less than 15 or 20% left in the reservoir, they didn't bother reconnecting the pipelines, to the gas reservoirs down there. So then there was this fundamental supply curve shift to the left, less supply, and the equilibrium price went up. And the market, now, of course, gas prices drive electricity prices even more back then when we had fewer renewables. So we had this one customer, and at first we were offering them something like 8 cents a kWh on a 2-year contract. And we're like, this just happened. You might want to lock in. Then they wouldn't take 9 cents, then 10 cents. They kept thinking it was going to go back down again, then 11. Then finally they locked in at something like 13 cents. And they took the whole 5 years as far out as they could go. And then a salesperson said, what's the logic behind this? Thank you for signing the deal. And he said, because at like 14, 15 cents, I'm out of business. So the first thing you have to understand as any business is, well, what's the percentage of, my operating costs, and how sensitive is my profitability to the cost of electricity? And what are the ways that I can potentially hedge, de-risk my supply portfolio? Some of it's contractual, but a lot of it is also maybe you're putting, solar on site or some kind of storage, certainly backup generation, and then some companies, I had one fast food chain that had me do an analysis for them a few years ago of what was their exposure to weather volatility around the country, and then what was their exposure to price volatility, because they wanted to know which areas they needed to focus more on putting like solar and batteries and more efficiency investments and that sort of thing. So that's sort of step one. And then step two is understand, well, I now know, okay, what's the percentage of my energy spend is relative to my whole portfolio and affecting my profitability. Now, what's the risk around volatility? How much does that impact my profitability, up or down? And so once you really get a sense of that, then you also want to know, well, what's my exposure to carbon? Because even though we now have a society that's relatively not sensitive to the carbon issue, at the end of the day, atmospheric chemistry really doesn't care whether we have an R, a D, or an I next to us when we vote, right? Atmospheric chemistry is indifferent to that. And eventually that will catch up to us. And the longer we wait, the worse it gets. So carbon has to be also figured into it. And a lot of companies are already putting shadow prices on carbon to help drive their decision-making in certain directions. And then, of course, there's the volatility of supply piece, or just physical capability of being supplied. So all those are critical pieces. I think the other thing I advise companies to do is look at what's the evolving technology mix out there today, and then where might that go in the future? And of course, companies like Meta and others that are so price insensitive because they're making money hand over fist, they can afford to invest in a Kairos modular nuclear reactor that's not even going to come online until 2032. That's not your average cat who owns a business right now. But that having been said, it's worth watching what these people are doing, because they're going to lay down the wagon trails going west that the rest of the pioneers will follow. And so knowing what they're doing and getting a sense of what the successes are and what the price curves are and so on, I think is going to help people navigate, where they should think about where this is all going to go in the future as well.
Super insightful. Peter, let's bring it back closer to today. We've had over the last 15 plus years relatively flat load growth, even though as a society we've been growing, but largely that's been driven by efficiency. That's changed and is rapidly changing with electrification and reshoring of manufacturing and data centers, as you've touched on. Over the next, call it 2, 5, 10 years, what challenges is this going to present on the grid, and how is this going to impact businesses? We're already seeing some companies, not being able to get the load that they want outside of the data center world, but just the locational. And I've also looked at, you touched on the capacity factor on the grid, but when we look at the age of a lot of the grid infrastructure, large grid transformers being far past their expected useful life. So what challenges is this new load growth going to present in the coming years, and how is it going to impact businesses?
Yeah, so let's start with the transformers and also the lines. Your transformers need special grain steel, and there's very limited supply of that. And in fact, right now, there's about a 3-year wait for transformers and switchgears, pretty high wait too. In fact, some housing developers can't put in new developments in certain parts of the country, let alone, businesses, right? So that's been a concern. And we also import about $4 billion a year of transformers from China. Last I looked, which is about 2 weeks ago. If you look at the gen side of this thing, new supply, the real issue there isn't whether or not there are more panels or the ability to build gas plants, et cetera. It's the issue of transmission. And so the first piece of that is interconnection. So if you want to connect a new asset to the grid, you got to basically go to the transmission owner or the grid operator and say, hey, I want to put this 500 megawatt or 20 megawatt or whatever it is, battery, solar plant, hybrid plant, wind, gas turbine, whatever it is, on the grid. And the first thing they say is, okay, we got to do a study and find out how's that going to impact power flows and is it going to result in increased costs? And then who's going to pay for those? Typically, it's that developer. Okay, so today, the median average age or time required from first point of contact for that study request to commercial flow of power is north of 5 years, according to LB&L's recent report on this. And it's been getting longer and longer over time. There's twice as much nameplate capacity out there in the interconnection queues as is installed on the grid right now. Now, it won't all get built, because historically about 20% of what's in the queue gets built. And then they also said, if there's a whole bunch of these smaller assets, 10 megawatt, 15, 30 megawatt, all in one area, they need to cluster up and study this all together and look at the impacts and then the shared costs of all of them. So that's going to help a little. And then you have other things like advanced conducting lines, that can then flow twice as much power through the new lines. And then you've got other technologies where you can take where you can take sensors and measure so right now your lines are at fixed capacity ratings. But the truth is, if there's any decent amount of wind and it's a relatively cool day, you can flow maybe even 50% more power over those lines. So we've had this rigid, static thinking to this. We can apply a more dynamic sense. And in some cases, you don't even need sensors. You can just apply AI to what's going on. So we can get smarter around how we're using our existing system, but we're still going to have to build new transmission. Basically supply is very inelastic. And then you have the issue of inelasticity of supply around the transformers. You have a recipe right now for demand increasing dramatically and supply going almost nowhere in the next couple of years. So I see this as a very inflationary environment, all things being equal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so lots of roadblocks and challenges with meeting the demand, and especially to your point, if I'm not a data center that is price incent, like I can pay whatever as a data center, I just need power now. Yeah. But if I'm a manufacturer and I've got margins that I need to meet, and I've got that price that I need to stay under, what are my options? How can I meet my growing demand if I'm adding more production lines or just trying to stabilize my costs because of this inflationary environment? What are my options?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're relatively limited right now. If you're in a vertically integrated utility, you kind of take what the utility gives you, unless you can get a special tariff. But if you're in competitive markets, which is roughly 60% of the electricity that flows across the country is governed by competitive markets, and then a smaller share of that is in retail supply, where you can actually go and you can buy this stuff. Well, now you got to have those conversations with your retail suppliers and say, look, what's the price right now for a fixed price load following where all the risk is taken by the supplier? Or maybe it's a block where I pay X for blocks and then there's an index and some kind of management of risk around certain pieces of it. But having a really good sense of what the prices are today and having the conversation with people who are in the space, with the power traders who are in and day out, that kind of energy literacy wasn't really necessary back in the days when demand was pretty flat. Now, you're going to have to become more electricity savvy than you were in the past because the dynamics are mitigating against, basically setting it and going to sleep sort of thing. You can't do that anymore. And then, of course, the discussion around, okay, maybe I looked at energy efficiency investments in my machines, variable speed drives, for example, or, insulation in a factory or something like that. Maybe a couple of years ago, it didn't pencil because the avoided costs were X. Well, now if they're X plus some percent, maybe they do pencil. And if you actually forecast going forward, they may be higher. Well, maybe it makes even more sense to think about some of these other investments typically folks won't do an investment unless it's a simple 3-year payback period, which to me is ridiculous. I would finance all day long at 30%. Dan, I'll go borrow. I would, mortgage my house again, basically, refinance the house if you could give me 30% rate of return. And yet you have plenty of commercial industrial facilities that turn up their nose at that kind of ROI for efficiency investments because they're so focused on selling widgets over here. And so I think one of the things companies really need to do is make sure that they've got really smart people in the energy management game because it means more than it used to in terms of the volatility and the risk and potential opportunities to manage that. So another thing, if you don't have an energy management system in your facility right now and you're spending, many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on juice, you should be looking into a good EMS that tells you how much power you're using and critically when you're using it. Because one of the other things, an emerging trend in this space, and it's only going to get more pronounced as we get better with AI and just data in general and connectivity, is we're seeing more and more of a push of utilities to reflect scarcity in their pricing. First with time of use rates, but probably more granular over time for customers who want it. And so having a good EMS that says, oh, here's how much I'm using, and here's my demand charge from the utility, or here's my time of use blocks or whatever, those sorts of things are going to be even more critically important in the future than they are today. And then what's the cost structure? Your market prices, and then of course your utility demand charges, and you might have transmission charges as well. And then how does your usage stack up against those blocks of prices, and where's your elasticity? How much can you change your behavior in response to that price environment? Those things you really need to know today if you didn't before.
Yeah, I completely agree, Peter. I think we're massive fans of the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. And I think in terms of controls and sensors, I think people are realizing now that you can actually reduce your energy consumption massively just with that alone. You then start stacking on the efficiency measures. And, one of our previous guests was saying, in an industrial facility, you can reduce your load by as much as 50%. Then you put on your on-site distributed generation and storage, and now your reliance on the utility is far less. What are you seeing in the market in terms of do you feel like the adoption and the interest and the previous misconceptions around price competitiveness and payback periods, especially when you start thinking about distributed generation assets behind the meter, you're starting to see that shift?
Yeah, I think so. That may be wishful thinking, but I based on some conversations, I have one client, for example, that does a lot of work in the mush space, and they now are having conversations with their customers that are completely different than they were 2 or 3 years ago around efficiency and time differentiated energy management capabilities. And so I think that knowledge is permeating more generally into the industry. And you see companies like Enchanted Rock with their backup generation and other companies that are offering not just simply backup power, but something that's much more market focused than we've seen in the past. So yeah, I do think that's changing of necessity because of the volatility and this new price environment that people are entering into. Plus the tools are better than they used to be.
So Peter, as we think, you mentioned companies, you mentioned some of the big tech companies and their drive towards decarbonization, but there's a lot of companies that are now participating in the Science-Based Targets Initiative and others that are making these commitments of net zero by 2040, 2050, 50% reduction by 2030. There's a variety of mechanisms that companies can use or levers they can pull in doing so. One of the things we find is most often seems that companies are thinking about VPPAs, virtual power purchase agreements, or physical power purchase agreements for offsite power, or renewable energy certificates and offsets. as you look at the levers, distributed generation, storage being another one of those, efficiency being another one, how should business leaders be thinking about that? And with some of the more commonly used ones, I guess today, of VPPAs and RECs, what are some of the benefits and the challenges, whether it's today or as we look forward in the next couple of years?
Sure. Well, I think that one thing it makes sense to do is sort of that spreadsheeting exercise. Back to Gareth's point, the cheapest power is the one, the kWh you don't use. And then it's the kWh you don't use when it's the most expensive, right? So you first start with the efficiency piece of it and understand what your costs are there and what you're trying to accomplish and what risks you may bear, if any. There are fewer risks with the efficiency piece because you generally know how it's going to overlay with your consumption profile. Then you move into PPAs or VPPAs. Well, the first thing you can do before that is look at on-site solar, for example, if you have rooftop space. Then you got to understand, well, can I actually sell that back to surpluses when I'm generating more than I need in the middle of the day, for example, with net energy metering back to the utility, or can I not? California, for example, with NEM 3.0, nope, now you can't sell it back to the utility except at a very reduced rate. So now your payback period's a lot. So understanding, where you are on that. If for example, you can't sell it back at a good price, what's happened in California? Now everybody's putting batteries in because they basically say, okay, if I've got a surplus in the middle of the day, I'll just charge the battery. And because the time of use rates are such in California that the evening prices and in the market, for example, weighted average price in California, wholesale prices last year across the whole year, middle of the day, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, were roughly $25 a megawatt hour because so much solar energy. Then the sun goes down, evening weighted average price around 100, 125. So imagine you have a battery, 90% round trip efficiency, maybe a little more, you lose some parasitic losses, maybe you're at 87% RTE. So basically, you're taking solar energy that you could sell back to the grid for next to nothing, storing it, and then avoiding these costs in the evening. And it's relatively predictable. So understanding the market you're in and the price structures there, that piece, the on-site stuff. But that's usually not going to help you if you're a big company with a lot of carbon management because you need a lot of space for solar, right? So then the big companies are going, well, now I really need tens of megawatts or hundreds of megawatts. Most VPPAs, you have to be in for hundreds of megawatts. And if you're a smaller company, you can ride along on the coattails of one of these larger companies as long as you're willing to take their terms. But let's talk about these for a minute. So first, you have the direct power purchases. Okay, so that means that the wind or the battery or the solar, all three of them, is in the same power pool that you are. So they're essentially dropping the electrons into the same bathtub you're taking the electrons out of. There, the thing you have to watch out for is, how are you settling? Are you settling nodally, based upon where the stuff's coming in relative to where the transmission is, or are you settling at hub, which is an average of prices? Because if you're not careful, basis risk can really hurt you there. So really understanding what the prices are and physical delivery on that. And then, of course, if it's solar or wind, it doesn't line up with the output of the solar, doesn't line up with your consumption. So yes, you're decarbonizing your whole bucket of megawatt hours consumed. But what you're really doing is you're exporting surplus into the grid or storing it in a battery, but you're also using, dirtier power from the grid, which is why companies like Google and others are going to 100% carbon-free energy, which is an hour-for-hour match of clean energy. They haven't quite got to 100%, but they're close to 95% with some of the contracts now. Okay, now let's move to, and so there the risk is, well, I'm hedged when the sun's shining, and maybe I'm hedged if I have a battery when I'm pulling from the battery, but what about the rest of the time? Well, who do I buy from and how do I structure that? And some retail providers offer a contract for that. Now let's talk about VPPAs. Okay, so you have a facility in Michigan or Virginia or someplace, and the cheapest place to get a solar contract or wind probably is Texas. Why? Because relatively easy to get them permitted. There's still interconnection capability there and a lot of land. Okay, so you're going to go build the thing there because it's the cheapest place. Here's what you got to watch out for there. This thing called negative covariance. Okay, so what does that mean? I lock in a contract. Let's explain the structure of the contract. So I sign a contract for differences, virtual power plant. Let's say the strike price is $40 a megawatt hour. What happens is now you have a contractual agreement. If the facility sells into the wholesale market, if they sell in at $42 a megawatt hour, the developer or the owner can't make more than 40. So you, as the off-taker, get the $2. Okay. Price goes the other way. Price is soft, goes to $35. Now you're writing a check for $5 for every megawatt hour to the owner. With me so far? Because the strike price is the 40. Okay. That's all well and good. If you're the first person into the market that bought that solar array, prices are going to be relatively flat. But let's look at the Texas interconnection queue today. There's 85,500 megawatts was the peak demand in ERCOT last summer in August. If you look at the interconnection queue right now, there's about 300,000 megawatts of renewables, mostly solar and some batteries, coming into the Texas grid, wanting to be connected. And the 18,500 megawatt CREZ line, the $6.8 billion, 3,600 mile transmission line that goes up into the panhandle in North Texas, takes nighttime wind. So it's pretty empty for daytime solar. What's going to happen over time, I predict, is the same thing that happened in California, where the duck curve pushes the prices down further and further and further as more and more solar comes into the grid. So let's say you bought solar at a $40 strike price when the solar is producing, and now you've got tens and tens and tens of gigawatts of additional solar coming in during the same period when your solar is producing. Now you get negative covariance. The price starts to sag more and more and more and more with each additional unit of solar coming in. So your strike price is still $40, but the clearing price gets softer and softer and softer. So you're writing bigger and bigger checks to that owner. That's negative covariance. Another way to think about it would be, I sometimes explain this when I'm doing a keynote, but I added an additional piece I hadn't thought of before. My first beer, I get a great degree of utility. The second beer doesn't taste quite as good, but it's still not bad. By beer number 5, I've got a pretty decent buzz on, and I'm not really tasting the beer. And if I go to 7 or 8, the next day I'm still paying for the mistake I made that night. That would be okay. But with negative covariance, not only do I get drunk and hungover, but so does everybody else at the party. Right? Because all those other solar assets, if they're not hedged, they all suffer from my behavior. So each new solar that comes into the grid causes everybody else to get drunk and hungover. That's the weird dynamic of it. So if you get a $40 strike price in a market with a lot more of the same type resource coming in, you face an awful lot of risk. And it affects the profitability of your whole business, not just your energy unit. That's the risk that I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate when they talk about VPPAs, is the dynamic of the marketplace when all the whole herd looks the same, right? They're all solar or they're all wind. Now, batteries can help because they can start to shift that energy from the middle of the day to the evening. And there you really have to look at, well, what's the relationship between the amount of solar going in and the number of batteries and how are they being used. And that now becomes really devilishly hard to sort of forecast. That's why VPPAs make me pretty uncomfortable because they affect your profitability and they have nothing to do with your core business. That makes sense?
Well, it does. And how do you see that also not just playing out as more and more coming online, but as more and more companies are just looking to get these? Do you see that strike price starting to creep up as well as the demand for these vehicles increases?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the reports coming out of Level 10 and Trio and some of these other companies that make at least some of the information publicly available, we've seen since COVID, post-COVID, prices went up a lot because of supply chain related issues. And then they haven't really come down. And I think part of that now is because we're into the supply demand dynamic where there's, again, a lot of straws in a small drink. And so that supply demand dynamic gets pretty fascinating. Now, if a lot of this stuff gets built in Texas, if the interconnection queue and everything that's sort of the promise of the interconnection queue, even if 20% of that gets built, that does portend a fair amount of supply, at least coming into that market. And maybe that pushes back against some of the upward price dynamic, but we haven't seen it yet. And I'm sure there are people who know a lot more about this than I, but from my viewpoint, this is what I see so far. Here I'm backcasting because my data is a couple months old all the time,
Yeah. And you feel the same about RECs as well, Peter? Is it, it almost feels like companies are setting themselves up, especially from a business perspective, for a lot of pain because they're now incurring the escalating energy costs and the risks that you've been describing. Plus, they're now trying to offset emission profiles by buying carbon credits that are also either going up in price or being called out for maybe not being legitimate or coming from the right sources. What are your opinion on carbon credits?
Yeah, so RECs are, the renewable energy certificates in the electricity space. You've got the ones that are bundled with the new projects, and you have that additionality piece. And then you've got the ones that are not associated. You can tie them to a renewable asset because every megawatt hour generated is registered someplace. And then when you buy the REC and you use your megawatt hour, you retire that REC. So that, especially those unbundled RECs, people look upon them less favorably because they don't drive change in the market. Then you look at the other decarbonization mechanisms out there. So the first one is you could buy renewable natural gas, for example, to offset your gas consumption, that sort of thing. But RNG right now, prompt month gas is just a little over $3 an MMBTU. And the RNG certificates are about 10 times that. So if you want to decarbonize your gas supply that way, pretty expensive. So a lot of people are saying, well, let's go and do the voluntary carbon market route. Okay, now you have to think about where are those avoided tons or captured carbon coming from. If it's something like direct air capture or capture from a stack, you can measure that pretty well. Where the risk comes in these days is those nature credits, like the REED ones that, for example, Kariba, that was the South Pole project in Zimbabwe. It was like $1 billion project. And that was predicated upon an assumed baseline of how fast that land would have been deforested in the absence of activity that South Pole did. And a lot of the benefits were supposed to redound to local communities. And what they found was the local communities did get almost nothing. I'm not laughing because I think it's funny. I'm laughing because I think it's tragic. And they also found that they dramatically overestimated the deforestation rate of occurrence so that it actually wasn't being deforested as fast. So therefore the preservation wasn't as, presumed preservation wasn't as big or as valuable. So that thing was a massive fraud and a black eye for the companies who had invested in those voluntary carbon credits and touted their decarbonization strategies. And then you got companies like Microsoft that avoided forestry or avoided, timber project in the Pacific Northwest. They were going to cut down trees. They said, we're going to change our behavior and leave more timber standing. So what happens? Massive wildfire. They literally go up in smoke. And so these are some of the risks that are happening. Now, it's also fascinating. The UAE, I think they bought 10% of Liberia's forests. And so another thing one has to think about is there's this whole issue of sort of neo-colonialism, which is Western or rich countries in the Middle East coming into these other places that are heavily forested and say, we're going to tell you what to do. You're no longer sovereign over your own area. We're going to buy that from you, and we're going to tell you what to do. So these things get really tricky really fast. At the same time, we got to find some kind of market mechanism to keep these forests from being cut down because they're a critical piece of the whole equation. And really important are peatlands, Gareth. The trees are one thing, but there are these massive peatlands in places like just to the east of Nigeria. I'm forgetting the country, and I spent a whole month there. I'll think of it in a minute. Cameroon. Massive peatlands in there that are huge carbon sinks that now scientists are desperate to protect. So we have to think about, we live in this massive interactive ecosystem, and we just sort of scratch around on the top of it as human beings, not fully understanding this thing we inhabit. We got to do a better job of understanding that. And we have to do a better job of understanding what the baselines are and measuring against them to know what are viable carbon credits and what are not. It's still in the infancy, but the good news is the recent COP had a pretty good discussion around more rigor. Right now, the accreditation agencies are all voluntary, not for profits. And it could be that we have to do something that brings a little bit more teeth to that game than we have right today. And I think we will see that maturity as those markets get bigger and these big corporate buyers demand more accountability and more rigor in that process because they're willing to spend billions of dollars if they can get what they rightfully expect from buying those credits.
Yeah, certainly. Peter, I want to spend just a couple minutes, shift gears a little bit back to power, and still in the vein of the interconnectedness of things. You've touched on in your book the shift from passive consumers to prosumers, and I think one really tangible example of that, which we're seeing today, and you have quite a bit of experience in, and I'm curious how you see this evolving, is demand response. And so, can you talk a little bit about how companies should be thinking about demand response? What mechanisms utilities are going to start to drive even further in this space? And one of the things that we see and where we support companies in looking at is how they can participate in these programs without completely impacting their operations by having some on-site generation and storage assets. So can you touch a little bit on how, the shift from passive consumers to prosumers and where demand response sits within that?
Yeah, sure. It was interesting. For many, many years before I got into the DR space and we built that business at Constellation, I didn't fully appreciate what elastic assets could do and what services they could provide. One example was really cool. We had this company that made aggregate for highways. They crushed rock in 20 megawatts of machines, 2 facilities, each 10 megawatts, different locations in Pennsylvania. And they sold 10-minute spinning reserve into the marketplace. So basically an ancillary service product. If something goes down, a transmission line or a power plant, you need something to be able to come up within 10 minutes and balance off the grid. So these guys, instead of being generation, they were absence of demand. And so they would bid in every single day and be called upon maybe once a month and they get paid really well just for being there. And so what I understood then was it wasn't just someone willing to say, oh, you can interrupt me 5 times for 10 hours sort of thing and get paid $50,000 a megawatt year like in PJM or New England or New York. It was also these other services. And in the beginning, we were dealing with these sort of crude big machines, 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts here. Over time, what we realized was the market needed more flexibility, because it wasn't just summer anymore. It was wintertime issues like we saw with Uri and recent storm Elliott and so on. And we understood we needed more sophistication and locational granularity because that's what the market started to respond as well. So now we find a market that's much more nuanced and sophisticated. And also we see the introduction of battery storage. So the first thing, as a business owner, we used to ask the business owners, what would kill your business if the piece of machinery didn't work for 6 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours? And how often would that really be an inconvenience versus, oh, I can just shift stuff around? And if these things weren't inconveniences or were minor inconveniences, how much would we have to pay you to accept those inconveniences? So that was our way at understanding that elasticity, the price responsive functions. So as a business owner, you should be asking yourself that and saying, okay, I've got these pieces of equipment. How flexible are my operating schedules? And what would it be worth to me to essentially sell those services back to the grid? Or it could be my retail supplier. I used to talk to our trading floor and say, look, if I could give you built-in physical call options in our customer base, what would that be worth? Because we're paying for those as power traders. So if you're a customer talking to one of these large retailers, say, hey, I know you got the formal demand response programs, but you're selling me juice. You're taking the risk on this. What if I can change my behavior with these machines this many times? What kind of a discount can you cut me? That kind of a conversation is not infeasible these days because sometimes, especially in a place like Texas where price Price can go to $5,000 a megawatt hour sometimes. Wouldn't it be awesome if I'm NRG or Constellation and I know I have these customers that if I just call them up within 10 minutes, they can shed? I've got this built-in call option, a derivative right there in my load base. So you as consumers, if you're large energy consumers, knowing what's your stack of flexible assets that you might have and how often could they be interrupted and what would the lead time be and what snapback might you have? And there's a super high degree of difference. For example, if you're an aluminum smelter, you don't want to mess with your pot lines because if they're out, they freeze up, you can incur millions of dollars of damage. We thought plastic injection would be similar, and they're like, no. With some of our molding equipment, we actually have a high degree of flexibility and price responsive capability. So again, it goes back to this issue of understanding what your costs are, and especially variable costs if you're on a block plus an index, for example. And what's your inherent flexible capability? And now increasingly, not just in wholesale markets, but we get back to the original conversation we had in the beginning about these assets on the distribution grid being thermally stressed for relatively short periods of time where the avoided costs during those times are high. What's the conversation that starts to happen either directly with the utilities or with an intermediary that can sell services to the utilities? It's not fully baked yet, but we're starting to see more and more utilities understanding that value. And the greatest example we've seen so far as a use case, have you heard of the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project? Yeah, BQDM. Okay, so this was like now many, many years ago, at least 5. And it was a bunch of yuppies, to oversimplify, moving into Brooklyn and Queens. And I'm going to additionally oversimplify, they had a great social life. So the peak there was from 7 to 11 o'clock at night. And Consolidated Edison said, if we don't change this, we're going to have to spend up to $1.2 billion on a transformer substation system and feeders. And so they went and said, well, what could we do instead? So they invested in lighting efficiency, which is a perfect overlap with the period of peak demand. They did a whole bunch of demand response. They put some batteries in, they put some fuel cells, some voltage management. And at the end, the last report I looked at maybe a year ago, they spent $116.5 million instead of $1.2 billion to solve for about 4 hours at only some times of the year. So you're starting to see, and then utilities, many of them now are starting to look at NWAs, non-wires alternatives, typically batteries on the grid. But you're now starting to see a mind shift in some of the leading utilities where they understand that this is a temporal issue that needs to be solved, that's very geographically specific. So if you as large energy buyers know that you're sitting in one of these constrained pockets where the utility might have to make some pretty expensive upgrades, you might have some ability to have a conversation and create value for them that you right now are unaware of. Now, it's not going to be in any case by any means, but I think that conversation is going to happen more and more because you look at utility planners, and there's Seattle City Light, for example, has a map showing all their transformers and when they're going to become stressed. Palo Alto, that utility says, if we pursue full electrification, 95% of our transformers have to be replaced. And then the Cavala study I mentioned in California. And Dan, you mentioned before that a lot of this equipment is aging out. Part of it is, we can't replace it all at once. So what's the value of deferring this replacement for 4 or 5 years? Those sorts of more nuanced conversations I think will start to happen as well.
Yeah, I love that, Peter. And I think the reality is, I think the stat is, our grid's overbuilt by 50% to accommodate these peak demand periods. And that's the reality, isn't it? If we can remove or at least smooth out that peak demand, we don't have to continue to overbuild or at least keep up with this real surge in demand. Let's use what we've got, but use it more efficiently.
We're bringing a sledgehammer to the game right now, and a scalpel in many cases would be much more advisable.
Yeah, I love that. All right, well, let's shift into our power surge round, Peter. And you've covered a lot of ground here. If you could be any energy technology, what would it be and why?
Okay, well, I love stuff for free. And I also love efficiency. And therefore, I would be a ground source heat pump because every kWh you put into it, you get 3 to 4 kWh out the other end because you're taking advantage of the Earth's 55 degree temperature for heating or cooling. So that's the one I would go hands down.
Tremendous. First time we've had ground source heat pump, and one that we've actually spoken to customers about exploring ground source heat pumps given their great efficiencies. Peter, you are extremely well read. You mentioned making your list of newsletters available to our listeners if they reach out to you. Beyond that, any particular books, podcasts that jump out at you, or really you got your list and we're happy to share it with the listeners if they reach out to you?
Well, I really do like the grid. There's one or two things in there I quibble with, and I think Gretchen Bakke maybe a little negative on utilities, just as institutions, but her explanation of the history of grids, and especially the critical thing that transformers did in allowing different, voltage. Lighting voltage was different than streetcar voltage was different than factory. Once you figure out transformers, now utilities can consolidate and become holding companies. She explains that so well. As an anthropologist, she's not one of us. She doesn't come to the space. Well, I wasn't, I'm a German major, but I should say that sort of outside view, explaining this in a way that makes sense. That book is unparalleled for that historical understanding of the grid and discussing where it's going. And then Bill Nussey's book, Freeing Energy, I had a chance to review that when he came out with it, and his understanding and his way how he brings his insights into what was going on in Silicon Valley and how he thinks about tech dev, and brings a lot of those insights and some of the financial developments too into discussion of energy and especially solar. There were a couple parts in there where I said to him, Bill, this is just masterful. I never would have been able to put these things together in the ways that you did. And so just for the sheer joy of watching an intellect having fun, that book's great because Bill's a great thinker.
Yeah, could not agree more. Bill actually sits on our board, coincidentally, Peter, and
okay.
It's super awesome that you bring him up. We just were hosting a innovator summit for a bunch of corporates in Atlanta together last week, and it was a really good time. Super good dude. And to close out, you're obviously passionate and, to your point before, obsessed with this topic. So really curious to hear how you answer this one. Finish this sentence, Peter. In my life, I will have been successful when?
Okay. So I did give some thought to that. At the end of the day, success is so much bigger than we are. You could say, oh, well, certainly success is, and for all of us it is, when we die, do people have nice things to say about us, and do our families and our loved ones really miss us? That's like sine qua non. But if we go beyond that and we go back to the initial premise of the conversation, which is we're trying to do this really hard thing as a society, success is when the world figures out how to leave a better place and a sustainable place for our kids. And someone could say, on all of our respective eulogies, oh, these three people made a difference in the energy conversation and inspiring other people to pick up the cudgel and move forward with it. Because ultimately, that's what you're doing, I think, with your podcast. And my job is to cross-pollinate information as effectively and efficiently as I can to make other people better at what they do. So if I'm successful in that quest, that's probably my highest and best use right now to society as far as I can identify it.
Yeah,
tremendous.
Love it.
We need more people in the space, more capital in the space, and more people thinking about the critical things like you. Peter, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the work you do, and excited to dig into the new book when that comes out.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I have truly enjoyed myself.
Cheers, Peter.
Beautiful. Thanks, Peter.
Take care.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.